and strategic focus. So the next domain is around roles, authority, and decision rights. So that's always the question sometimes is like, well, okay, well, whose decision is it? Whose role and responsibility is this? Whose authority is this? Who decides what? And does everyone agree? You know, with any organization, there has to be very clear delineation on whose roles and responsibilities are what. There was a very interesting situation that happened with me, again, with the previous organization I was with, and it blew my mind because I was actually in a board interview for this organization, and they have just recently experienced quite a lot of turmoil in their governance. But as I was sitting in my board interview, I was asked a question, and I don't really necessarily recall what the question was, but when I had the chance, I asked if I could ask a follow-up question, and my question was, well, what exactly is it that you go over during your board orientation? And I get this glazed look in the room. Nobody had even heard of a board orientation, so I asked if I could ask a follow-up question. My follow-up question was, okay, well, so if you don't have a board orientation, when is it that you review your job descriptions and your roles and responsibilities as a board members? And one board member even said, we have job descriptions? And so, when all of a sudden boards start losing sight of, when the executive committee starts meeting without the board's knowledge and minutes aren't taken or actions or decisions are made without the board's knowledge, when things start going awry, or the executive committee makes a decision that the board should have made, or the staff should have made, or the CEO should have made, when all of a sudden things start happening like that, that there is a lot of confusion around whose roles are what, who has the authority to do what decision rights exist. And so, when you have a board of directors and you have volunteer boards, paid staff, committees, there needs to be very clear delineation of whose roles and do what. So again, there needs to be it needs to be very clear about who decides what, and not only who decides what, but does everyone agree about that? It's not just about who decides what, it's does everyone actually agree on that? So again, when do you know when it's not working? Well, the first thing is people start second guessing everybody's decisions. A decision gets made in the board meeting. Somebody says, well, who made that decision? Who's responsible? Do you have the right to make that decision? Well, I don't know. The executive committee met and they decided this. Well, do they have the right to do that? What about if the finance committee comes in and with the budget and that's what they say? Well, does the finance committee have the right to do that? Well, according to the bylaws, they do. Well, maybe the board didn't even realize that. So, it's all these different, making sure that everybody understands like whose roles and responsibilities are what, because again, there has to be clear roles and responsibilities within policies, within bylaws, and things like that. And that's why it's so important to make sure that these things are very well spelled out in your policy manuals, your bylaws, and then not only are they spelled out very well, but then they're clearly explained to everybody who's a part of that. Sometimes you have situations with officers acting independently. They think they have the authority to do certain things, but then when you go right down to it, they actually don't, because of the way the bylaws are spelled out. And maybe the bylaws do say that, but maybe the board doesn't know that. So there's different things that, again, people think they have the authority to, but they don't. And some people don't think they have authority, but they do.
Jim, let me
Or you
ask you
get into
a
that
question.
situation. Yes,
Let me
yes,
ask
sure,
you a
man.
question right there.
Yeah,
You got
yeah.
me thinking. I was working with one client and their articles of incorporation, their bylaws, and their policies and procedures were jumbled into one big mess.
Oh, mm,
And 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 I helped them, separate out which is what. But
right.
just how much do you see? Because especially the time that you spend with association executives in North Carolina. I, I mean, how many organizations have you seen out there? Is there, I don't know if you can say a percentage or anything, but that just their documents are so screwy and so convoluted that they don't even know what they don't know. It
Oh, Absolutely. Well, the problem is so many times, when you think about it, I had a great friend of mine who used this analogy of, board members are like people who bungee jump because they bungee jump into a board meeting for 45 minutes and then they bungee jump out. They're literally there for 45 minutes, they do their job and then they're out. And then you think about, now you take that on a scale of, over a 2 or 3 year period. Now these same people are only there for maybe a 2 year term, a 3 year term, and then they're out. And so, you have this consistent cycle. And so, if you don't have, it's kind of funny. I actually worked with an organization that at the time I really thought it was kind of overkill. But every other year, they purposely had a committee in place. It was a committee that was appointed by the chair each year. It was the oh gosh, I can't even remember the name of the committee, but anyway, not important. But it was basically a council that advised the president every year. But part of their job every year was to go through, and they would alternate years. One year they would review the policy manual. One year they would review the bylaws. Sometimes they would change things, sometimes they wouldn't, but it was just an automatic routine that they just got in that every year they would just do that, just so that it always got done. Because, I remember Jeff DeConnia did some exercise at a meeting, and this has been years ago, where he went through and he asked, board member, people in the audience to stand and raise their, or not stand, but just raise their hand and said, okay, how many here work for an association that's been around for, 20 years? Obviously everybody in the room, raise your hand. How many 50 years? Most everybody still 50, how about 75 years? Less, but still a good number. And then it was like, okay, how many people here have worked for an association who's been around for over 100 years? I mean, there's still a good number, but and then he asked a question that blew my mind. He's like, okay, now keep your hands up, those people. He's like, how many of you think that there's language in your bylaws that is probably there that has still been there since your organization was around 100 years ago? And everybody just died laughing. And he's probably not wrong. Like there are probably organizations who have been around for over 100 years that probably still have language in their bylaws that's never been changed because it's that old. They just nobody's ever took the time to really look at it. And so to your point, yeah, I mean, if you don't have those regular processes of examining these documents, but again, these board members, they pop in and out, that's not important to them. Bylaws, I mean, I love association stuff, but are bylaws fun to look at? No. I mean, and articles of incorporation, like most people would probably be like, what are those? I don't even know. What is that? You know? So, I mean, yeah, I think organizations have got to do a better job of at least making that a part of their regular, just a regular habit of at least making that, just a cleanup process, at least okay, do you have to do it every other year? Maybe every 2 years, 3 years, something,
At least every
So,
5 years.
I mean, at least something, So, but, probably somebody said that line right there. Well, I thought that was staff's job, going back to that line. I'm sure everybody probably thinks those kind of things. Well, I thought that was so-and-so's job. Well, I thought the secretary usually was supposed to like organize those things. Or I thought the CEO reviewed the articles every year. And like nobody, again, if it's not somebody's job, if it's not clearly defined as like, okay, well, whose role is it? Is it the secretary's job every year to look through and just make sure that the bylaws and the articles and the policy manuals are at least in sync, just to make sure, or they're filed? I mean, Ed, how many times have you worked with an organization who's, especially like, and I've seen it work with charity organizations who's gone 2 or 3 years and they hadn't filed
I 90.
their 10 either their 10 or their
I 90.
990s,
Yeah.
or they're like with the state of North Carolina, for example, you have to file with the Secretary of State's office a charitable solicitation license. And I've worked with groups that are like, they go in, the CEO comes in, and they're getting ready to start, soliciting for charitable contributions, and the Secretary of State says, no, 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 you hadn't filed your charitable solicitation license in like 6 years, and they're
You're,
like, what?
you're
What?
gonna giggle, Jim. Here is my Cigar Pegs California Registry of Charities and Fundraisers postcard reminding me I got to get that thing done. Got to do it
Yep.
every year.
Got it every
Or,
year. But see,
but
it's like, but whose role is that? See, again, it goes to all those things. Like, you can't. you can't assume that, like, again, the old assume thing, you can't assume that it's somebody else's job to do this. There has to be very clear roles and authorities and make sure that everybody knows what everybody else is doing. So,
Let me just ask you a question on that, Jim.
yeah.
Um, so, what are your thoughts? I completely agree with everything you said about making sure that everybody knows who's in charge of what. Do you see that more as a CEO function, or do you see that more as a board function, making sure um, all of these tasks are assigned to somebody?
Um, I mean, I think it's probably more the CEO at least keeping a track of it, at least having a project, and I say, and the beauty of it is, especially nowadays, like, oh my gosh, we have so many project trackers and technology with like a Monday.com or Asana or whatever. I mean, like there is no excuse. Like I could understand back in the day when you had the file cabinet and the piece of paper that had the timeline, but I mean, you can't tell me you can't create a Monday.com schedule now and say, okay, every year set up the Monday.com that every year we're going to go through and check off that calendar that, the policy manual's been updated, the bylaws have been updated, that all the conflict of interest statements to the board have been sent out and updated, that this has been happening. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't assign it to whoever that secretary is that year or the vice. I mean, assign it. I always love saying, like, sign it to the vice president. Nobody ever, they don't ever have anything to do.